Well, welcome back, everyone. Before I introduce our next speaker, I wanted to respond to a question that came up in the chat during the break. And the question was, what is the origin of the logo of Western Field Ornithologists, the beautiful and striking Savins gull? The image was produced by Ginger Johnson, who was one of the founders of the organization and is still involved in the production of Western birds. John Dunn tells me that the choice of Savins gull for the logo goes back to the founders of the organization, and they include Alan Craig, Guy McCaskey, Pierre de Villers, and I'm forgetting someone, Cliff Lyons and Jean Tresurin. So if anyone in the audience has further insight into that choice or whether other species were considered, please feel free to enter that in the chat. I'm sure other people besides me would be interested to learn more about it. And special thanks and shout out to Ginger for her enduring work that still graces our logo. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Lee Tibbitts. Lee is a biologist for the USGS, working out of the Alaska Science Center, where she's been studying Alaskan birds for over 30 years. Her recent work has involved long-distance migration of shorebirds using emerging technologies to get the kinds of incredible results that many of us have been hearing about in various publications. Today, she's going to speak to us about the long-distance migration of buff-breasted sandpipers. Take it away, Lee.
All right, thanks, John. Nice to be here. Is that the right setting, Jen, or should I switch it to the other?
We actually don't see your screen right now, so try sharing your screen again.
There. Can you see that now?
Oh, here it comes.
Okay.
All good.
Okay, and then as far as which mode for the...
Yeah, go ahead and start your presentation.
Okay. I'll start here. It's underneath the... underneath the... Okay.
Okay, and that is the presentation mode. So now go to the display set to, I think it's the display settings, and you can change that to your, there we go. We see it just right.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, hi everybody, nice to be here. Today I'm going to talk about a satellite tracking study I've been involved in for the last few years. And we started the study in May 2016, and over the next 3 years we tagged over 100 buff-breasted sandpipers, and we got a whole bunch of big mix of long and short distance tracks. And a lot of my job with all these tracks was to put it all together and make sense of it, because we had so many different systems going on in there. And it really was the first comprehensive assessment of the migration route of this species. And I just started out with this picture because being a shorebird biologist in Alaska, I'm so used to thinking of sandpipers and shorebirds being so wild and out in these wild, beautiful places. But in reality, buff-breasted sandpipers spend 10 months of their year in agriculture landscapes and in human altered habitats. And that's what I saw when I went down to Texas to ban them. Before I get too far along, I wanted to thank all my co-authors on this talk. And this really was an international effort, because this bird goes across so many countries. The main players were Rick, Joaquin, Juliana, and Gabrielle. They had studied the birds before, and so they brought a lot of bird knowledge with them. And really, the study came about because of their expertise. And here's some photos to go with those names. And what we called ourselves was the Buffy team. And I resisted that term for a long time because it sounded so almost too cute. But that's what everybody who studies buff breasts of sandpipers calls them. They call them buffies or those boofies or wherever, it depends where you are, what you call them. But that's what I will use probably throughout this talk. Here's a picture of me with Rick Langto. He really is Mr. Buffy. He's been studying the birds for 30 years. He did his PhD on the breeding behavior of buff breasted sandpipers on the North Slope of Alaska to describe their lekking behavior, which is kind of an unusual behavior for shorebirds. And there's Juliana in Brazil. She did her PhD on puppies also, looking at winter movements. Joaquin in Uruguay. He did his master's on puppies. And then Rebecca up on the North Slope and other folks. There's Gabrielle in Argentina. So there was a lot of expertise that came here. And what I brought to the whole team was just my experience with tracking shorebirds and getting tags on them and interpreting tagging data. And just a real quick natural history of buff-breasted sandpipers. They are collegious now. They're a medium-sized shorebird. They breed in the Arctic. And actually, their breeding area goes all the way over to eastern Chukotka. Not on this map, but they do go over there, a small proportion of them. And then they winter way down here in the pampas of South America. To get back and forth, of course, they have to crisscross the whole Western Hemisphere. And that generates a migration of over 30,000 kilometers. So they are kind of some of the longest distance shorebird migrants we have for shorebirds. And throughout this whole route, they really are dependent on grasslands. And they will use modified grasslands or natural grasslands, depending on where they are. But they do really there's such a focus on that habitat. And it's really interesting. That's what we really found out when we did the study. There's an estimated 56,000 birds, some confidence intervals on that number, but it really is only from one site. It was really generated from the rainwater basin using turnover rates of radio tag birds. So it's really unclear going into the study if that number holds up, if it really is what the actual population number is. And then I just wanted to mention that they are unusual. This is a in their breeding habitat or in their breeding behavior. This is a buff-breasted sandpiper doing a lekking display, and they are the only North American shorebird that lecks. There's 2 other shorebirds in the world that do that too, but here in North America or in the Americas, they are the only shorebird that does that, and it is kind of an odd behavior, and it kind of plays into movements. That's why I wanted to, and that's why I mentioned it here. I'll show you later how that plays into their movements in the breeding grounds. So the question, why study buff-breasted sandpipers now? Why do we want to know? And why are we even interested in this bird? Well, it's because this current population is pretty small, 56,000 birds, but also because historically they supposedly had a very high population size. And that was pre-commercial hunting, so pre-1880s. They're one of those one of the species in the Central Flyway that was heavily targeted for hunting for the markets back on the East Coast. So there's a lot of anecdotal information from that time period about how many birds were actually taken. And the anecdotal information is from the actual places they were taken, like in the Midwest, where people were actually shooting them and they would provide bag limits for the day and whatnot. And then also down in South America, where they all of a sudden realized there's no buffies coming back. They're just not here anymore. And that was all contemporaneous with the decline. People were noticing that. And then at the same time, the habitats were also being affected. Like the habitats in North America were being tilled for agriculture. The habitats in South America were being tilled or grazed and tilled for agriculture uses. So there was like all these things going on at the same time. And we think that's when the population really crashed. So what it was historically, we're not exactly sure. But what we do know now is that its population is not growing. It's flat. The trajectories are flat. And also the trends are either flat or downturning in all the small areas where people actually track them. So we don't have a comprehensive population estimate, but we have these certain study areas where people are looking out for their birds, and they all report either flat trend lines or downward trending populations. And so our question was, is this lack of recovery in population size related to their movement ecology? Can we look at the broad picture, the big scale picture, and find out, what is going on throughout the range. Are there certain areas where they might be being targeted or might be being affected more? And can we do something about it? So this was our study area, and it's essentially the annual range of the buff-breasted sandpiper in the Americas. And even though those Russian birds do breed over there in Chukotka, they do come east and migrate to this flyway too in winter down here in South America. So all the birds in the population do fly through this route every year, or they occur in this route, in this range all year, every year. And our objectives were pretty general. We wanted to identify migration routes in an unbiased way by using satellite tag birds. We wanted to really understand their stopover behavior. How long do they stop? Where do they stop? We wanted to look at the land cover associations at those stopping areas and get a sense of whether the few studies that have occurred over the landscape or over the range of this bird, if they really represent what the birds really are looking for. We also want to look for the best sites to actually monitor the numbers of birds. So those sites would be places where a large portion of the population occurs, and just a site that is accessible, because this is a large area and it's hard to get to many of the places that the birds are. So to meet these objectives, we used satellite tracking. And of course, we had to wait until the tracking tags were small enough to put up buff-breasted sandpipers, because buff-breasted sandpipers are small birds. They really typically weigh about 70 to 90 grams. So they're tiny. They're like a killdeer size or a tall Dunlin size. And when we found, we were so happy in 2015 that a couple of companies made tags small enough for these birds, and we jumped right on it. So the companies were low tech up in Canada. They made a GPS pinpoint tags, what they called it. And microwave telemetry here in the US made a solar powered Argos transmitter. What we really needed in a transmitter was a small tag. So something less than the 4 grams that these were, which was great. We also needed a tag that would remotely upload the data, because we knew we could not recapture individual birds. We tried, other people tried, we just knew we couldn't do that. And plus we didn't really know where they're going to go. So we couldn't do radio tracking. We couldn't rely on any kind of knowledge of where they're going to be to get the data. So we needed remote uploading of data. And that's what these 2 tags provide. And I just want to point out that here in the GPS pinpoint, you can see there's 2 antennas, and the short one is for downloading GPS locations. It does kind of like what it does on your phone. It reaches up to the GPS satellites and says, okay, where am I? Tell me. And then there's a longer Argos antenna, which they both have, because they both transmit, or they both send the data over the Argos system. So they both have these long antennas to communicate with the Argos satellite system. And then this pinpoint has the 2 to do GPS also. So that's, yeah, I just want to compare the tags a little bit, because this was one of our biggest, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to deal with the tagging data. Pinpoints are battery powered. The PTTs or satellite transmitters are solar powered. The location accuracy of the pinpoint is GPS accuracy, within 7 meters. The PTTs, it's the Argos location classes that could be really good, up to 300, down to 300 meters, or quite large, up to 2,500 or even larger. It's hard to know the actual accuracy of a Argos location. And since the pinpoints were battery powered, there was a limited number of locations that they could collect. When we first started the study, they could only collect 30. It was very limited. Then later, the next couple of years, we could get up to 90, and we could program those locations to be collected over whatever time schedule we wanted to. So if we wanted them all in winter, we could do that. If we want them once a week through the migration, we could do that. For the PTTs, since they're solar charged, they will provide data when they are charged. And theoretically, that could be several locations a day for years. But of course, they didn't last that long, but some lasted quite long. And here's what the tags look like on the birds. Again, buffies are pretty small, so these tags look huge on them, but really once we let the birds go after tagging them, they would preen them into the feathers, and all you could really see was the antenna coming out. And based on their long subsequent tracks, the tags probably didn't affect them as much as you would think. And we had 3 different attachment methods for the pinpoints. The first year we glued some of them on. And that's the 10 here. You can see we glued 10 on directly onto the birds' backs. In 1 year, we put the Argos tags on with the body harness that was provided by the manufacturer, and that worked pretty well. But we really prefer leg loop harness on shorebirds just because it doesn't interfere with the wings and it doesn't get around their bodies. So they can just be much freer in their movements, and we don't have to worry about gaining and loss and gaining of weight and affecting the harness. So given that, we really wanted to, even since these birds were so small, we really wanted to focus on getting the larger tags on the larger birds, and the larger birds happen to be males. The males are slightly larger. They're not hugely larger than females, but they are enough that we felt like we got to figure out who's a male, and we'll put the pinpoints on them. So the way to do that is when you capture a bird in the field, you look at their underwing, their outer primary underneath, they have these black dots. And if it's a male, they're very large, relatively speaking, they're large dots and they're very distinct and dark. So the males are pretty obvious, and we confirmed all our sex designations with molecular analysis later, and we were correct in all of them. So we got pretty good at that. And you can see the females were slightly smaller, and generally overall, our birds were pretty small relative to what people had caught over in previous years and what they're catching now. So I don't know what happened in those 3 years we were catching birds, but the buffies were not in great weight condition. So that meant that the attachments were like 4 to 7% of the bird's weight, which is a little bit high. You don't really want it that high, but we had no choice, and the birds seemed to tolerate it quite well. So of the 94 pinpoints we put out, 85% were on males, like we hoped, 15 on females because we ran out of males in Brazil. And then we put 22 PTTs out, half and half, more or less, on the 2 sexes. And these are our tagging sites. We really wanted to spread the sample out because we wanted to be representative. And we also wanted to make sure that we weren't biasing our sample by going to one location. And that was, we weren't really sure what the routes were of birds. So we wanted to spread our sample out across all the possible places that they could be and that we could get to. And these are the places that met both those criteria. And so in Alaska, we tagged them up on the North Slope, Rick's old study area, put some GPS tags out on males there. Texas, we went in the spring and in the fall, put tags on birds that were going south and tags on birds that were going north. Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, we went there in the winter, and all the birds there, of course, were going north. So we ended up with 22 PTTs and 94 GPS, which is a lot. But I will say, as I mentioned earlier, the GPS tags didn't provide a huge amount of data, so those are a lot of partial tracks in there. And I just wanted to show generally where we caught the birds in Texas, just for fun. It was new to me, these sod farms, these buffies really enjoy. Turf farms, they call them down there. It's where they grow grass for lawns. So it's like walking on your lawn. I mean, we were walking barefoot on these lawns because it's so hot, and we'd catch them with whoosh nets there. We could actually herd the birds into the whoosh nets, and we got good enough where we could see like a male in the field and say, okay, we want that bird to walk into the net because he's big. And then somebody would go out and twinkle them or move them into the net area, and we'd catch them that way. So that worked pretty well. When we were in Brazil, we did night lighting because that's what they do there. Again, in coastal pastures, looks similar to Texas, but there's cows on this turf. In Uruguay, we were in coastal pastures again, but they use clap nets there. And they have some unusual animals for an Alaskan. There were emus walking around. That was kind of fun. But very similar habitat. And then in Argentina and Alaska was similar, but different methods. In Argentina, they would tag them in coastal pastures, but they use cannon nets. In Alaska, they would tag them on the tundra, and they use mist nets at the lecking sites because the birds are distracted. So it was just kind of funny to me that we went to 5 different sites and we used 5 different methods to catch these same birds. Everybody has their own way to catch them, and the birds behave differently wherever they are. So the next step then was to process these data that were coming in. We had 3 streams of data. We had the GPS locations from the pinpoints. We had Argos locations from the pinpoints also, because when the GPS or when those pinpoints communicate with Argos systems, sometimes they also transfer Argos location. So that was kind of a mixed data set there of different spatial resolutions. And then from the PTTs, we only had Argos locations, a lot of them. And this is like what it looks like when I first got the data from the pinpoints. It's all over the map, literally. And it's kind of a mess, but you can see the pattern in there. So you're trying to figure out a way to actually get rid of all the erroneous locations without getting rid of any of the good data. So the first thing to do is to remove GPS locations with CRC equals fail, and that's a low-tech term that's in their software, and it really just looks at the number of bits and how they're lined up and whether they're lined up correctly. And so they do that for you, but you still have data afterwards that still doesn't, it still is obviously erroneous, but you have to get rid of yourself. And for some of these, I just had to manually go in and say, okay, this bird was never over here in the Pacific Ocean. I know that that's based on his movement rates. And, so you have to go in manually and just filter it manually. And then when you clean that all up manually and you add back in the Argos points, you get this nice pattern. So these are the pinpoint data and they look pretty good. That's what we weren't 100% sure that's what birds were going to do, but it looks like they're all doing similar things. So that's good. And then we added Argos locations in with that, filtered everybody the same, and came up with our data set. And here's our cleaned up data set. We have a lot of locations, almost 40,000 locations from 116 birds. We have 2 birds with a complete annual cycle. So that went all the way from breeding to wintering and back to breeding, or wintering to breeding and back to wintering. We had one of each of those. And then we had 12 complete northbound tracks. So the birds started here in the Pampas and went all the way up to the breeding areas, and 10 complete tracks of birds going south. But obviously that's only 22 birds with these complete tracks. And so we have almost 95 birds with some partial data. Of course, we wanted to use all that data. We wanted to use all the data we could because it's very hard won data, and it's also important to spread out the sample. But before I show you how we dealt with the partial tracks, I'll show you the complete tracks, what the birds did, because this really illustrates the routes. Going north, 11 birds going north, starting from the Pampas. They go through the central continental Amazonia, fly away in South America, hang out here in Colombia for a while, then cross the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico to hit the coast of the US in Texas. And they take this narrow blue band up through the eastern edge of the Great Plains. I gotta get my cursor back. Where'd it go? And up to Canada, where they spread out over, when they fly they spread out over the boreal forest and land up here in Nunavut, Canada. And coming south, they kind of do the opposite, but then they head farther to the west of all the tracks. So you get this kind of figure 8 pattern of going, the sinuous pattern going north and then the opposite coming south. And the tracks were really these are minimum estimates of how long the tracks were, and they were almost 17,000 either way. So at least 30,000 kilometers flying time or travel distance, a little bit more than that. It's pretty remarkable for a small bird like the buff-breasted sandpiper. And then just for fun, here's the 2 false annual cycle tracks. This is one female from Brazil and a male from Texas. So this male went up to Canada, came back through Texas, back down to Brazil, and then back up to Texas. So that's his annual cycle. And the female went from Brazil up through Texas, through that little narrow corridor in the Midwest, and did her little circle over the breeding areas. Altogether, they spent just a couple months on north migration, a month and a half breeding on the breeding grounds and post-breeding, 2.5 months southbound, and up to 7 months down the wintering grounds, which is really typical for a migratory shorebird to have that kind of split in your annual cycle. And then coming back to this table a little bit about the tag comparisons. I just wanted to point out that the all this information is the same, but here in the median locations per tag, the pinpoints, we only had about 50 points per tag. So not a lot to deal with or to use per tag. And the PTCs, of course, were a little bit better than that. So all these partial tracks. We decided to actually be able to use these partial tracks. We would have to model the data. And to do that, we modeled it using our script called foie gras. You probably heard about it. It's being used a lot right now to model tracks of satellite tag birds or tracks of anything. And what it does is it predicts locations every 12 hours along your tracking data route. And it predicts that based on locations before and after. So for example, if you have a bird that one day he's on a riverbank, the next day he's on a riverbank, a week later he's still on that riverbank, you're going to pile up a lot of 12-hour timestamps right there, and you'll know, oh, he did stop. That's where he was for that week. If you have a bird that was on the riverbank, and then a week later he was up in Canada, you're going to have these really big jumps in your time steps. And did that happen? You're not really sure unless you have data in intermediate data to affirm that that's really what happened. So that's what we do have with a lot of the pinpoints, is all this temporal uncertainty. So this is what we're trying to do when we model it like this. So we predict locations every 12 hours, and then we use some decision rules to decide whether that bird has stopped or not. And this is kind of what it looks like. I hope you can see this, but in this panel, this is the empirical data. This is what we received from the tag. So it came from Alaska, this particular animal, and he moved across the landscape. But this is, you know, these are big gaps in these data or these timestamps. We're not really sure. If, for example, I get one location out here, did he actually stop there? I only have one location, I'm not really sure. But then I applied the R script of the foie gras, and it puts 12-hour timestamps around each of these points and along that whole route. And when you see the big pileups, that's where the stops occur. And this is a little bit more zoomed in, and I don't know if you can see, but those green dots are something we would designate as a stop based on some decision rules, like it has to be there for more than a day. The uncertainty around these estimates has to be a certain uncertainty, and excuse me. And that's how we model the stops. Anyway, so here's some results. In panel A, you can see an estimate or an analysis from eBird from the Cornell lab on what they believe the birds do based on their observation, their observer network. Down here in this legend, the points are colored by season. So for this, the blue is wintering, non-breeding, and the yellow is southward migration, and the blue is, and the green is northward migration, which you don't see a lot of green in this. So they must not have had a lot of observations. Sorry, allergies coming on here. Anyway, so that's what we knew before when we went in on this. And then we also had a few geolocators. So we had 3 birds that had geolocators on them in previous years. And they did a similar route. But as you probably know, geolocators are not very precise, and it's really kind of hard to interpret them sometimes. So we were happy that when we put satellite tags on, these are our females and these are our males, we kind of confirmed these routes, which was good. They know what they're doing, these folks. But we also filled in all these gaps where they don't really know what the birds do, like in the boreal forest, for example, or when they cross the ocean here or the Caribbean here, or when they cross the Amazon, really what are the birds doing? So that's where, you know, our data really is starting to fill in that big picture. And this is the females here, and these are the males, and there wasn't really any big difference we saw. So we kind of lumped the sexes for all the other subsequent analyses and summaries. And for the timing, for the timing of migration, this is a 1 year, we took 1 year data and just compared males and females. So in this, you got date, month on the bottom axis, you got latitude here on the side, and up here on the top, you've got sample size. And really, this is the blue are males and the red are females. And it just shows you how many locations we had per day per sex. So Here we didn't have very many. Here we had a lot. That's all. And each line is a different animal. So what this shows you really is that, you know, what folks had always said was that the males leave first. They leave in like April from South America or from their wintering grounds along in the Pampas. Females leave about a month later. Then they all kind of meet up here in Colombia and Venezuela, then bop up to Texas area. You can kind of see the latitude over here in this side map, and then head up to the breeding grounds, the females still lagging the males. They all spend time up there, and then they kind of meander back home, but still stop in Texas, still stop different places. Everybody's much more dispersed during non-breeding and not so much on a time schedule. But that was good to know that the males are first, females come second, and it takes, you know, which is basically what the limits are on that migration season. That would really help with the population estimates that are coming on, or people are working on. And then here is a map of what the habitats or what the ecoregions looked at like at the places the birds stopped. And I just want to show you, we'll first look at this little map here. This will show you the range of what we're looking at here. We're looking at North America, and the stops, these are actual model stops and stops that we know the bird stopped here. Each dot is a different stop. The size of the dots tell you how long the bird stopped there. And then we kind of divided it up into 3 regions because that kind of naturally broke out that way. So down here in coastal Texas, you can see during north migration, and over here in south migration, the birds stopped really within one ecoregion. And that ecoregion is the, what is it? It's the Western Gulf coastal grasslands. That turns out to be a really important ecoregion for these birds. And that's where the current survival estimate is being generated. So we're really happy to know that our birds all stopped there, and they really were in the polygon that is the survey area. So that's great. And now we have a turnover rate for these guys that can be applied to those survey data. And that will really come up, generate a nice survival estimate. That's being worked on by Jim Lyons over in USGS. And we found that the birds stayed about 9 days on average there. So who's good? Happy to know that. Then coming up to the mid-continent, these birds really skirted, or they really went on a narrow band. I think even though the migration tracks sometimes look spread out, they only stopped in a very narrow band. And that was really interesting to us. And here they are right in between parklands and grasslands, going north and going south. Pretty similar stopping areas. And then up in the breeding area, not a lot of stops during northward migration, not a lot of long-term stops, which makes sense because they're breeding. And we really are looking at post-breeding movements here. These are migration movements. But everybody went, all the birds went to eastern Nunavut during post-breeding. And that was really interesting for us to see too. Of all the types of the ecoregion types that we were looking at that are in this assessment by Dimestein, grasslands, prairie, parklands, those are the main ones, and that makes sense for this grassland specialist. These are what these ecoregions look like. These are actual points. People went to these points where the birds were, and they said, okay, they did some measurements, and this is what they look like. Pretty low vegetation, emerging croplands, low veg and open spaces is what this bird likes. And then this is the same maps, but for South America. So again, here's a small map showing all the stops, both north and south. Each dot is an individual stop. The size of the dot is length of stay. Again, we divided up into 3 regions because it made sense to us just looking at this. And we've got, you know, just north of the breeding area here. This is the breeding area mostly, or sorry, non-breeding area, just north of the non-breeding area. The birds stopped in Paraguay in these temperate grasslands and savannas. In the central part of South America, they didn't really stop very much going north, but coming south, that was a really important area. And they were really into the moist and dry forest, but also the Benny savanna lands. And up going north Colombia and Venezuela, the plains there, the grasslands and savannas, they were extremely important to these birds. Not so much coming south. South was much more, everybody do whatever you want. We'll meet you on the non-breeding grounds. And again, Llanos are the biggest ecoregion type going north. And these tropical forests coming south. And I think when it says tropical moist forests, I mean, we haven't gotten that deep into the habitat data yet, but these are really where the birds are based on the GPS data, where they are is in these really big, these small openings within the forest or along river bars. They really land along the river, which is really fun to see, like along the Amazon River. And these are typical habitats in South America. Looks very familiar to the ones in North America, in my opinion, except there's an emu. So then we put all these stopover data together and said, okay, what are the important areas, or where can we monitor? What should we be paying attention to for these guys? So we looked at, percent or the probability that a bird would be within a certain kilometer in a certain time with compatriots. And this is what we came up with. Going north, again, Colombia, that whole Llanos area is extremely or well used by the birds. Coastal Texas, they stop there in spring, going north. Less stops, but still important in mid-continent, in Nebraska and Kansas. And then there's a nice stop here in Alberta and Saskatchewan where they tend to stay and wait for the Arctic to open up. Coming south, you see that movement all the way to eastern Nunavut. Lots of birds. That was really kind of key to the whole population as far as we could tell. They stop in the Dakotas going south, and then Nebraska again. And then Texas again, coastal Texas. That's really what they like. And they think that's where they bulk up on their way before they jump across the ocean or the Caribbean Sea. That's where they can get reliable food, but also they're as far south as they can go. And they're going to wait until they get a little fat before they go across. And that's where they're in the turf farm habitats. Some birds stopped in Nicaragua on the way south. And then we had these two little important areas in Peru and Ecuador, and then the Beni savannas here in Bolivia, which is really cool. It's kind of a new area for us. It was just been discovered maybe 5 years ago, and discovered or really paid attention to it like 5 years ago. And people from down there called Rick and said, we've got a lot of buff-breasted sandpipers here. You should come and check it out. And it is this high plain savanna that they just really seem to really enjoy. And then based on these maps, what we decided was if you're going to monitor numbers of buff-breasted sandpipers, Texas, so accessible. They go there both north and south. Everybody goes there. That's a good place. If you are in Canada, you could try that area in Nunavut. That'd be good too. And then in spring in Colombia, you could probably set up some kind of nice monitoring scheme there also. And then I've been showing a lot of maps, so I just want to show some pictures of people, smiling people holding buffies, because that seems to be what happens when you hand a buffy to a person. They just automatically break out in smiles. And this older lady here, she was so cute. We were in a Texas turf farm sitting out in the sun for, I don't know, all day. And nobody in Texas sits out in the sun. That's really not what you do. And she came out finally, said, "What are you guys doing?" She was kind of worried about us. And then we said, "We're, catching the sandpipers." And she got to hold one, and she was just thrilled. She thought that was the best thing. She had called them pipers all these years, and she was so happy to see one up close. So in summary, what did we learn that was new? We learned that the buffies do this whole thing where their migration strategy is to jump over ecological barriers like forests and oceans, because there's nothing for them to stop and eat. Then when they get to the grasslands, they either stay there or they hop along a little corridor and make their way north or south. Migration corridors, especially in North America, are really narrow. So much so that we're really trying to figure out why is that phenomena so ingrained in them? Why can't they spread out a little bit? And then the timing was variable, especially between males and females. And those are our monitoring hotspots that I mentioned before. And we also found out that habitat needs seem similar across seasons. Wherever you're going to go, where there's buffies, it's going to be 2 to 5 centimeter grass or veg. It can be a field, it can be a pasture, it can be a natural grassland, but it has to be really low and really open. And they've had to adapt to agriculture across the range. Everywhere they live, they compete with humans for these wonderful pastures and grasslands. And then we also found, I think, that turnover rates at these stopping sites are a little bit higher than people had previously thought. So I think that will play into the population estimates that folks are working on. And as far as our next steps, we're in the process of modeling range-wide habitat use and needs. We're looking at a whole bunch of things, but instead of just throwing things at the model, we're really trying to think about it carefully beforehand. And, what are we really going to look at? And some things that we're looking at right now are this aridity index, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I'd show you is in this very narrow corridor here is where they stop along the way north. And it's also the wettest part of the Great Plains. So is that it? Are they really focused on the wet soil moisture driving all of this? We're going to work with the Shorever Collective, which is a new group out of Smithsonian Institute, which is putting together a lot of data, tracking data for the Central Flyway of the US and trying to come up with, habitat models, but also conservation approaches that will work for a bunch of species. And they're going to really target it using the tracking data. So that'll be really fun to see how that plays out. And then we really need to pay more, or we really want to spend more time thinking about what is really figuring into what's influencing their stops and their routes. With that, I think I'll stop and wait for some of your questions. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go down to the questions and see what we have. Here's one from John Dunn. Are there any potential breeding birds west of Chilcoca? That's hard to say.
West of Chilcoca? Not that people. Oh, go ahead and finish.
Yeah, that was his question.
Okay. Not that we know. I mean, nobody's ever reported them, as far as I know. If Bob Gill's on the call, he might be able to speak to that. But yeah, they seem to be along Chilcoca, but also really primarily on Wrangell Island and another island up there, and then a little bit on the coast of Chilcoca, very much towards Beringia.
All right. It looks like some of the questions got into the chat. So I'm going to go into that and bounce back and forth. So then we had a question about any relationship between the West Coast population and the central migrants. Are there any studies that have been done there?
No, you mean the ones that, like, in the fall, West Coast migrants or buffies go down the West Coast, and they are assumed to be part of the whole big population, but we don't know if they're Alaska breeders, Chilcoca breeders. I mean, everybody thinks they're the Chilcoca breeders, but we don't know that. And then there also is a population that goes down the East Coast, and those tend to be the juvenile birds. So they kind of keep going from Nunavut, and they keep going across to hit the coast about Maine, and then go down to Florida, and then across to South America.
Okay. Here's a question from John Critcher. I don't know if I heard you correctly, but it sounded like you said that relative to bird body weight, the satellite tags are heavy, in quotes, and glued on. Do the birds eventually shed the tags? Any information on how this might affect lifetime reproduction success?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's something we study a lot. Yeah, I probably didn't make that clear, but there was a few different types of attachments. One was glue on, and the other two were harness, but all the harness material was biodegradable. It was meant to fall off after a certain time because we knew the tags weren't going to last that long in terms of the battery life, so we didn't want them to stay on very long. And as far as we know, they did do that. We can't follow buffies that well because they're so inaccessible most of the time. And I said they're kind of heavy. These tags are kind of heavy for buff-breasted sandpipers because the recommended weight ratio is like 3% of the bird's body weight to be a tag. Everybody says that in every paper, but then most people, if you've got a small bird, you often exceed that. And in my experience, tagging shorebirds for a long time now, it really is more about the fit of the harness and the tag than the actual extra gram of weight. I've seen birds that should be able to handle a tag not do well because the tag was too loose or it's too tight, versus birds that it's all snug and all nice in and it's a couple grams heavier and whatever for them. That's my experience. We've done a lot of papers about that, though, about the weight ratios.
All right. Another question from John Dunn. I'm guessing you are dealing with mostly or entirely adults, as with birds, juveniles move on a broader front. Nearly all of many California records are juveniles. Maybe you can catch juveniles on the Alaskan North Slope?
Okay, yeah, and that's exactly what you said. In the fall, there's a broader front. All the tagged birds were adults. Yes, we only tagged adults because they're big and heavy. But when you see the total eBird maps with all the observations, you do see birds on both coasts. And those on the East Coast are for sure juveniles. I don't know if they've really established that for the West Coast. They probably have, but they don't report that in their reports. But that would be good to know too. And that makes sense to me.
And the last one I have here is from Philip Unit. When stopping in southbound migration in South America, were the birds using paramo above the tree line in the Andes or just the lowland habitats?
Just the lowland habitats. Yeah.
All right. Well, that concludes the questions that we have. So I want to thank you so much, and I'm going to kick it over to John Harris to tell us what's next.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Jen, and thank you to all the attendees for your questions and your feedback in the chat as well. That's really helpful to us and much appreciated. So join me in thanking Lee, and we'll be on a break for a little bit, and then our next session, which starts at 3:30, is a second science session of the day. So we'll see you at 3:30 after a short break. Thank you.